Hello and welcome to this week's What Were They Thinking? Amongst the news items we have for you this week, IARC is behaving in an improper manner, trying to step outside the scope of what it's supposed to be doing. The coronavirus recombination pathway, which has allowed it to develop, mutate, and cause as much trouble as it has to date. How some bacteria may be contributing to endometriosis. How certain amino acids could improve telomere length, thereby, at least theoretically, decreasing the risk of cancer. Fungi that cause flies to enter into a death climb so they may spread their spores as far and wide as possible. Norway is pushing back against the European Union's rules around genetically modified foods. The idea that you could have a spray-on dress, or for that matter, any other design of clothing you wish. Critiques of just how much time and effort is wasted on modifying papers to fit with journal guidelines, and the world's largest fusion project is experiencing a lot of problems. The timestamps for these and other news items can be found in the description box below. We'll start with artificial sweeteners, and specifically aspartame. Aspartame is a common artificial sweetener used in all sorts of things, whether it's something like Diet Coke or Pepsi, chewing gum, and more. All of these things use aspartame because it has 0 calories, but is incredibly sweet. As you can imagine, at the moment there is a lot of interest, let's say, and a lot of this interest is being, artificially generated. And it seems to be generated as part of a litigation process. One of the big steps for this is to get IARC, or the International Agency for Research on Cancer, involved. This is the same group that claimed glyphosate was carcinogenic, which, once you look at the body of literature, it isn't, but nonetheless, that's what they've done, so they're notorious for that at least. The issue here is not so much that they're looking at aspartame itself, but that they've published something on aspartame called Monograph 134. This monograph was looking at the issues around aspartame and whether or not it could be contributing to cancer, and you could say that this is jumping the gun. The reason we say it's jumping the gun is that normally there are several steps involved in research into cancer and its relationship to a given thing. In this case, there is a step before by another committee called the Joint Food and Agricultural Organization, otherwise known as the WHO Expert Committee on Food Additives. The way this is meant to work is that they take all of the available data or publications on a given thing, they have a panel of scientific experts review this, and then they publish their own monograph or report on its safety. Once they've established what is a safe dose, then you can start looking at what issues may be associated with that. Specifically, we're talking here about an acceptable daily intake, so rather than a single dose, for example, if you get a single dose of medication, this is more like exposure. The current safe dose is about 40 milligrams per kilogram of body weight, and this has been reviewed repeatedly since 2015, so we have about 6 or 7 major studies by this body into aspartame and its safety. This is why IARC is jumping the gun. Normally you have the establishment of what you could consider a hazard assessment, but that comes after risk assessment. After all, if there's no risk, it doesn't pose a hazard, and IARC is jumping straight to a hazard assessment after ignoring what has already been conducted as a risk assessment and found there is no risk. So this is a problem. They're ignoring their own procedure. More importantly again, is that at least 2 member states, Japan and the USA, have both written to the World Health Organization stating that IARC should not be doing this, specifically because it's outside of their jurisdiction, publishing multiple different reviews, or in this case outcomes, from the World Health Organization would send conflicting and confusing messages, and finally, that it's not necessary. The most stunning part about all of this is that after the colossal cock-up that was the IARC report into glyphosate, the World Health Organization made clear that they needed to coordinate with other groups within the World Health Organization. For example, the Joint Food and Agricultural Organization, or WHO Expert Committee on Food Additives, to make sure that they were consistently reporting on the same thing, not stepping into each other's territory, and not screwing up like this. This is despite already having been told that they had to wait to do this work by the World Health Organization. This was because the Joint Committee on Food and Agriculture had priority. This means IARC not only ignored explicit instructions in which they were told to wait, but managed to further undermine what little credibility the IARC had left after their cock-up with glyphosate and other reviews that they'd conducted since. In other news that's at least positive of a kind, we have a phase 3 trial for Chikunguya virus. This is a virus which is, well, unpleasant to say the least, but unfortunately it's relatively understudied. In this case, thankfully, the virus has at least a theoretical vaccine available. The vaccine is, however, only in a phase 3 randomized trial, so there is still scope for it to fail spectacularly. However, being in phase 3, the chances of that are significantly lower than if it were in, say, a phase 1 or 2. Just under 99% of the participants in the population for this study were protected, and the protection ran out to about 6 months after they were vaccinated, although that is just the end time frame for when they were looking at how long it was there. At that end time frame, between 18 and 64, just under 99% were affected still. Those over 65 had 100% protection, and at 180 days it was just over 96%. Like many viruses like this, for example chickenpox, it's not necessarily going to kill you if you're otherwise healthy. However, if you're not healthy, then you're in for a lot of trouble. So young children and the elderly are especially vulnerable. Next we have the pathway that coronavirus takes to, well, recombine and mutate. This is one of the biggest concerns with coronavirus, the ability for it to mutate and constantly develop new variants. The new variants are A, not able to be dealt with the current vaccines because we don't know what they are yet. 2, they may or may not be more infectious, or worse yet, have much greater mortality rates. And 3, we don't know exactly what they will do anyway. So if we have a virus that is something we can't predict, we can't treat for, and we can't handle, if this comes out of nowhere, or worse yet, the current strains of coronavirus mutate significantly, all our efforts to date will be for nothing. This is why work on SARS, the original SARS, is at least able to give us a leg up and mean we could fast track the coronavirus vaccines, but we still needed a completely new vaccine for it. Whereas, if it happens again, well, who knows how prepared we are for the next variant, or worse yet, the next major disease. Another effect of COVID-19 is the sudden ballooning of the population of children with RSV. RSV is a particularly nasty virus, but it particularly affects the very young and the very elderly. It's respiratory syncytial virus, and whilst yes, currently there is a vaccine for the elderly, we don't yet have it for children. The hope is that sometime in the next couple of months, there will be a vaccine that will be given to expecting mothers that will protect children, but we don't have it yet. This doesn't help the sudden ballooning of the population though. This increase is a problem, especially since there is a percentage of these kids who will die, who will have long-term effects, and those who need to be hospitalized, although they will recover. One of the theories around why this has happened is that after 2 years of relative isolation, the children haven't had exposure to the various diseases and pathogens that they need to for their immune system to basically train up and develop strength. Without this, those kids have a weakened immune system and are therefore much more vulnerable to viruses like this. And because of that, RSV, amongst others, is taking more of a toll on them. In a similar line of reasoning, but related to protection from a vaccine, we have the possibility that the shingles vaccine may lower dementia risk, and this could be building on what's happening with the flu vaccine and the perceived reduction in risk of Alzheimer's disease and similar neurological diseases from last week. The evidence isn't exactly clear, but it does indicate that if you are infected with herpes zoster, otherwise known as measles, or for the elderly shingles, it's possible that you have a higher risk of developing this. And it could be for exactly the same rationale as with influenza. That is, the body fundamentally forgets to react to certain stimuli, or perhaps more accurately, antigens. When it fails to react to these, your body doesn't clear up the necessary materials, and so your brain begins to accrue unwanted and damaging material. There is a positive side to all of this, and the first is that if you have received the chickenpox vaccine, you may never have to worry about shingles. That's because you can't be infected by it in the same way. Particularly, you can't be infected to the extent that you will have to worry about it coming up again and causing you trouble when you're much older. However, not everybody who's elderly has had that option. The second benefit then is that there is a vaccine for shingles specifically, and this should provide protection, not necessarily perfect protection, but considerably more than simply having to deal with having shingles until they go away. While the research is not necessarily entirely original, it is well supported within the framework of existing publications. It is, however, preprint and not yet properly reviewed, so yes, it does make sense, but waiting for editors and reviewers to weigh in and give a much more in-depth review or opinion on what is or is not appropriate about this study. In further developments relating to exposure to pathogens and the possibility that they may contribute to other issues down the track, we have bacteria and endometriosis. Endometriosis is the development of endometrial tissue outside of the uterus. This means that every month, due to the nature of the female body, the uterine tissue or endometrius will grow and then die off and turn into blood, and then be expelled from the body. The problem is, when it's not in the uterus, it doesn't have very many places to go, and rather obviously, it's tissue that's dying. That's not something you're going to find very pleasant. As a result, many issues aside, trying to address the root cause is probably the best possibility. The study itself is relatively small, with 79 females with endometriosis and 76 healthy women for a control group. What they found was that the Fusobacterium had a closer relationship to this than anything else. Findings aren't exactly perfect. About 64% of the females with endometriosis had the bacterium present within their uterus, or specifically the endometrium, whereas 10% of the control group did as well. This means that there is about a 54% greater prevalence, but that raises some interesting questions about the control group as well. For example, if you were to follow them up on a longer term basis, would this 10% of the control group happen to develop endometriosis, further or at least better supporting the underlying theory that Fusobacterium infection is at least partly responsible? This is where animal model research is at least somewhat helpful. The big takeaway with the animal models is that they found by giving antibiotics to the mice, they were able to reduce the size and, to a certain extent, treatment needed for endometriosis. This indicates that there is some kind of cause and effect relationship, and the genetics research they did alongside this further supports some of the evidence around this, particularly around the awakening of otherwise dormant cells and the development of tissues outside of where they should be developing. In news throwing back to COVID, but particularly about COVID and possible treatments for long COVID, it's a study looking at Metformin, a relatively common and cheap drug for diabetes. It was found that by giving individuals Metformin, they had 40% less risk of developing long COVID compared to the control group, although this is only a placebo-controlled trial, so we need to take it with some salt, largely because, well, we have a relatively small cohort at 1,126 individuals, and it's COVID. COVID is at the best of times a mess. The strengths to this are that they are a phase 3 trial, so we are looking at increasing numbers of trial participants, a preceding data set that supports it, and at least in theory, something of a better base on which to build the argument. The reason why we have reservations about claiming that this study is exactly strong is that they followed up the 1,100 and some individuals for 10 months, so a relatively long time frame, at least for this kind of work. 35 participants who took metformin developed long COVID, whereas 58 were from the placebo group. So yes, there is a smaller risk, but again, these numbers are tiny anyway, so it's rather hard to say. In total, with both the placebo and the treatment group, we have less than 8% of the total participant pool developing long COVID. And that's the problem here. If you had everybody involved, either developing or not developing it, it might be slightly better, but when we have something between 3 versus 5%, the fractions are relatively small, and so it definitely needs a lot more study to be able to figure out how valid this is. After all, we're talking about giving people medication for something that might theoretically happen for, what is this, roughly 1 in 24 people? Yeah, it's not exactly a promising line of reasoning at this stage. Slightly more promising is the idea that taking amino acids could help with telomere length. Telomeres are the things at the end of your chromosomes. They're often described as being something of a cap on the end that prevents damage to the DNA within. And while you can still damage DNA with full-length telomeres, the shorter they get, the more likely it is to happen. As a broad rule, the longer you live, the shorter your telomeres get. This is why older people are more likely to develop cancer than not. Obviously, ways to extend telomere length could be useful. The study in question found that taurine, one of the more common inclusions in things like energy drinks, could contribute to either maintaining or lengthening telomeres. The publication relies on a few different things here that are some weaknesses. The first is that they were looking at data from monkeys and humans that did measure taurine levels. However, that data was not intended for this study itself. Rather, it was a, let's say, fortuitous byproduct. In the same stroke, though, it has provided some data that's useful. They then built on this by looking at worms and mice, which was an interesting option. The median, that is the most average increase, was between 10 and 23% for worms, which, to be quite frank, probably doesn't translate that well, versus mice where it was 10 to 12%, which is considerably more likely to translate to humans. It is worth pointing out that the fact that we've observed this phenomena is not the same thing as saying that the phenomena is what's happening. Well, perhaps it's more accurate to say it doesn't necessarily mean there's a relationship between them. It could just be that whatever's causing individuals to live for longer, or in this case have longer telomeres, is also contributing to the increased levels of taurine. For example, it's something you often get from eating things like meat, fish, and dairy products, these contributing to a rather more balanced diet. If you have a more balanced diet, you are more likely to live longer. So we need to be very, very cautious with this study. In medical news, we see further evidence of a shift, or at least change, in the situation around transgender treatment and medicine. Notably, yet more lawsuits are being filed against the transitioning of minors, and this is a concern. Not necessarily because the lawsuit itself is the problem. Rather, it's the basis for the lawsuit. At the moment, there are a lot of concerns across the world around how children are being treated, and particularly around surgical interventions. Then there is issues around the hormonal treatments that are involved. As these concerns continue to grow, there are more investigations, and now there are, well, in this case, litigation. The issue here has to do with the transitioning of a 12-year-old. The process began with what is generally recognized as the standard process, or at least increasingly common standard now, with many services not using the Dutch protocol. The process involved giving the 12-year-old girl puberty blockers, then cross-sex hormones, and then a double mastectomy by the time she was 13 years old. This is a very young age for that to be done. Unfortunately, we're given a lot of information, but to be quite blunt, the article is rather biased, so we're not going to go into a lot of depth on the arguments made, as it seems to be rather on the side of the litigant. And whilst we can, let's say, empathize with their circumstances, it's rather hard to know, given that this is, well, basically the litigant's argument just wrapped up in a nicer packaging. The important thing here is the age and the significance of what was done, and hopefully, given that the hospital hasn't responded, they might actually get a court decision, and if that happens, we'll be able to see just what was decided and on what basis. And this could be useful in understanding the shifting environment around medical care, especially of transgendering minors. As they transition, it will be important for health services to consider not only what they're doing, but how they're doing it and the various processes or controls that they have in place. This would obviously prevent issues like this litigation from happening elsewhere and for others in the future, but there may be a rather explosive controversy in the near future as the recent years are caught up to. In similar neurological news, but neurological news related to what sounds like it should be the start of a horror film, fungi are infecting flies, and they cause them to fly up high, where they eventually burst and spread their spores. Yeah, this does sound very much like it should be the start of The Last of Us, or something similar, but not quite, thankfully. The study used fruit flies, your most well-known and recognized research animal, otherwise called Drosophila. They are the typical option for a lot of research, whether it's genetics or, in this case, fungi. They were then infected with the fungi called Entomophora muscae, and they watch what happens. What happens is that the fungus gets into their brain and starts fiddling with the internal clock and hormone-producing parts of it. This leads them to just keep flying higher and higher, until eventually they die. Once they die, the fungi continues to spread throughout the host until eventually it goes pop. That's not what's exciting about this research, and we use exciting with perhaps a little bit too much zealous. The important thing here is the way that they make the fly, fly high. About 2.5 hours before the fly is going to die, its brain is completely hijacked, and parts of the fungi reach into the fly's brain and start activating parts of the sensory and motor system. This increases the activity of the wings, and that's what forces them to, fly high, otherwise known as summiting. Shifting to news that's slightly more controversial, Bud Light. The piss in a can that America called beer and was their favorite until very recently. Recently, they had Dylan Mulvaney as one of their influences, and unfortunately, that has not worked out. They've now dropped their market share by about 25% as a result. That loss in market share is huge. It has been picked up by another brand called Modelo, which, in the end, hasn't actually changed anything as far as the landscape of American beer is concerned. Somewhat ironically, both brands are owned by the company Anheuser-Busch. This means that even if you boycott Bud Light and buy Modelo instead, the money goes to the same place. This is the first time that Bud Light has fallen out from the top spot for about 20 years, so this is not necessarily big news, but certainly a big blow to Bud Light. Hopefully this will put a lid on those who said that there was no evidence that choices to either boycott or otherwise avoid Bud Light were having any real effect on the brand. Admittedly, as said, it's not going to affect the parent companies of either company in the end. Next we have interesting news from Norway, and the choice that Norwegian government has made to push back against European regulations on genetically modified foods. You could summarize it as Norway is claiming that the European Union is unfairly punishing genetically modified food by comparison to conventionally grown or developed products when they are, for the most part, comparable in the degree of effect in the end, that is, what is in the food that you eat, whereas the methods by which they are developed are much safer for GMOs versus conventionally modified foods. This means that the food standards are disproportionate. The Norwegians have, in short, said that they find the restrictions on GMOs are not justified by scientific evidence, they stifle innovation, and that they prevent dealing with societal challenges, like, for example, food security. The Norwegians are not calling for there to be no regulation at all. In fact, they've described it as being 4 tiers of regulation, that being no assessment is required or a complete assessment is required, with steps in between. They also believe that there should be traceability involved. Shifting to other environmental news, and this time rather surprising news at that, the fact that humans have shifted so much groundwater through pumping that we've actually altered the way the Earth is spinning. Yeah, we have literally removed so much water from parts of the world that we've altered how the Earth moves in relation to the poles. Now, this is not a huge shift, and that should be very clear right now. It's tilted the Earth about 80 centimeters. This is somewhere around 30 inches. The researchers believe that it's around 2,150 gigatons of groundwater that had to be moved to shift Earth's rotation by the necessary 80 centimeters, or 30 inches. That means for the duration of the study, we have effectively moved the Earth about 4 centimeters or 2 inches each year. The challenge was establishing just how this was the case, given that, well, we're talking about Earth and it's kinda hard to measure it in this sort of way. That's why it had to be measured in relation to Earth's rotational poles, and these are how we know what's happened. Not only what's happened, but the rough time frame and the rough amount of water required for it to occur, although again it does require some modelling to have happen. Next we have news on fashion, and that's perhaps something we were never expecting to have in one of these videos, but it's the spray-on fabric, or as the video below shows, the spray-on dress. The idea is to have a material that's suspended in a solvent, which when sprayed will dry and solidify as is. This allows you to create clothing almost instantly, which in theory is great, except that, well, when you remove it, it's gone. That's where the second part of this is at least somewhat useful. It's something you can dissolve, resuspend, and then recycle. Very much like old clothing used to be used to make paper, where you would have fabric with the wood fibers to create very nice, very rich paper. Something that's no longer required, but it was done. In these terms, it's not needed necessarily to recycle it for other purposes. Rather, it can be reused again to recreate clothes. The advantages of this technology are many, and the article from Nature goes through quite a few of these. For example, including extra materials in it. For example, something like antibacterial, antimicrobial substances would allow you to create very quick, very effective seals for open wounds. Next we have social media news and a study into the effects of social media on doctors and medical scientists, particularly online, and what happened during COVID-19. The gist of what they found is that social media was a significant factor in the amount of harassment that doctors and scientists experienced from social media as a result of things like misinformation. As harsh as it is to say, most individuals have no idea what they're talking about, and they will spout nonsense, which, given what YouTube is, the irony has not escaped us. The important thing is that a lot of individuals received a lot of abuse because they were talking about things that they were familiar with, they were educated on, and that they did have the appropriate background to be able to explain or understand, to individuals who did not. And as a result, they received considerable amounts of abuse, whether that is being doxxed, harassed, or more. This is where the study goes into a lot more detail as to the methods and the findings they had. It is important to note that the entire study relies heavily on a survey, and it's a survey that had over 1,000 responses, but only 359 of those responses could actually be used. Further to that, there was a considerable skew towards females with over 200. There were 140 males and 16 who identify as transgender. Given the nature of the method used and the results that they obtained, the findings should be taken with a considerable amount of reservation. That's because it's a very small response rate, and within that response rate, it's a even smaller amount again for what they're trying to achieve. Further to that, as with many surveys, you'll find that those who respond generally respond because they have an interest in doing so, which is why you need many, many responses. In further academic news, there's the other publication from Nature which talks about just how much money, time, and effort is wasted making, publications before their publications fit to journal guidelines. As a general trend, you will write your manuscript, and it will be the introduction with the background, your methods, results, and then a discussion. Oftentimes, you'll be writing this with the idea of submitting it to a particular journal, or possibly several if you are able to find ones with similar requirements. But each of them has their own formatting necessities, whether that is margins, how you position figures, or many other things. All of these are often very different and very tedious to do, which is why if you can get similar journals and you can line them all up, you don't need to stuff around trying to reformat everything for every submission when you get rejected from one journal. This is why the more than $230 million price tag exists for all of this time and effort wasted. And yes, $230 million worth of time. That is a ridiculous amount of time and effort when you have to spend all of that just trying to make an article be able to be reviewed by an editor to see if they'll accept it, let alone actually accept it and then have to go through the review process itself. This is why we can wholeheartedly endorse the proposal that journals should allow for free format submissions, or there should be some sort of at least reference standard that allows individuals to have a stock standard template that they can write to and submit to a journal and say, will you consider accepting this, and have an editor either decline immediately, or close enough to given the glacial progress of most editors, or at least not have to worry about spending days and days formatting an article, or at least at this point in time a manuscript. Shifting to other news, and news that's at least slightly more entertaining, it's an article talking about how an obese woman is demanding that airlines allow them to basically fly partly for free, and that's simply because they're obese and they don't have enough room available next to them for another passenger to fly. This means they have to pay for 2 seats. Well, yeah, they've taken up the room and, to be quite frank, the mass of at least 2 individuals. It makes sense they'd have to pay for 2 tickets. This is being done under the auspices of inclusive travelling experiences. And no, if you are obese or fat and you don't fit in the seat, you don't fit in the seat. This is not to say that if you are a, at least relatively average-sized individual, the airline seat shouldn't accommodate you. That's a separate issue again. It's that if you are obese, which is you're well and truly above the average in any way, shape or form, you're not being discriminated against when they expect you to buy a second ticket to accommodate that. The person in question is so self-unaware that they say people with smaller bodies get to pay 1 fare to get to their destination, and we have to pay 2 fares even though we are getting the same experience. If anything, our experiences are a bit more challenging. Yeah, say that to the poor sod stuck between you and the wall, or you and the walkway, who has to be squished by you. The idea that they might eventually get their wish, which is a uniform policy for tickets, is at least somewhat funny, as the only realistic way to do this is either to charge people by their physical size or their physical weight, which means that obese individuals would be charged much more. Next, we have an interesting article from Scientific American and how it discusses the world's largest fusion project and the issues to do with it running over budget, behind schedule, and all of the issues tied into this massive project. The project should be a world-setting record, however, it hasn't yet been finished. It's located in the south of France, and it's at work amongst 35 different countries, and the idea is to create a giant fusion power machine. The name of it is the International Thermonuclear Experimental Reactor, the acronym being ITER. In an ideal world, this project would be allowing humanity to start developing fusion energy, that is, energy made by putting molecules together rather than splitting them, which is what happens with both nuclear, which is fission energy, and with something like, say, coal or gas, where you're burning fossil fuels. Admittedly, fusion energy isn't necessarily the same ideal as sustainables like, say, wind power, hydro, or solar. It does, however, have the advantages of being much more consistent in its output. This makes the basis of it great in theory. The practice is the problem, and this is true of all theoreticals. Any lad that practices both theory and practice will know that in theory everything works, in practice nothing does. That's why the 35 countries collectively agreed to put $5 billion into it. That would supply the facility with everything it needed to come online over 10 years. That 10-year deadline was meant to pass in 2016. Unfortunately, that has not happened. Neither has the €5 billion amount been achieved, or rather it's cost more than €20 billion, or $22 billion. It's also now 2023, which means we're more than 7 years behind schedule at the moment. Given that this was meant to be a system online in 2016, then 2020, then 2025, it's now possible that it could be in 2029, which means it will be 13 years late, and who knows how many billions of dollars beyond what they are expecting to spend. The last news we have for you this week is all about the possibility of summoning Cthulhu in the next week, as we have a planetary alignment. Well, at least a planetary alignment. Cthulhu's in question still. 5 planets should align on the morning of June 17th, shortly before sunrise. We should be able to see Jupiter, ideally. You'll also find that there's Saturn, Mercury, Neptune, and Uranus. If you are in a light desert, that is somewhere where you don't have any artificial lights present, you should be able to see the last 2 with the naked eye. However, if you don't, you'll probably struggle to see Neptune and Uranus without either a telescope or binoculars. Since we are talking about the planets furthest from Earth, they're not going to be incredibly large and obvious, or at least relative to what you would expect with something like, say, Mercury or Venus, in all cases. As a result, Most of them will appear fairly small and not necessarily obvious, but they will all be right next to each other, so having 5 dots of light show up should give you an idea about what you're looking for. There are various sources available to try and find out where, when, and what to look for, but we'll leave them up to you to find. That's all the news we have for you this week. Thank you for watching. If you found this interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please post any comments, questions, or suggestions you have below.